When this woman woke up yesterday to go to work, she expected a quiet morning routine. But things turned bizarre when she discovered a hidden camera in her home. With fright in her heart and panic in her voice, she called the police. And because of this call, her brother got arrested. Woman discovers hidden camera in her home. 1 day later, her brother gets arrested. Almost immediately after Claire woke up from her slumber, she discovered the device. She opened her eyes, pushed her bedsheet to the side, and went to the mirror to wake herself up with water. But before she even arrived, a single ray of sunlight entered her room and reflected on something in the corner. The reflection was odd since that part of the room was pretty plain. It was a simple white wall. In front of it only stood a dull wooden cabinet with nothing on it. There was simply nothing light could bounce off. But still, a bright reflection shone in Claire's eyes. "What is that?" Claire inched closer to the cabinet, following the beam of light. Once at the cabinet, she saw that it led to the backside of the furniture. There was a cluster of tape nudged in there. Claire gave the thing a hard pull, and once it was freed, Claire got the fright of her lifetime. And that panic was justified because she saw a camera lens right in the center of that tape cluster. It was small, but the glare of the black-rimmed object was unmistakable. Claire's eyes grew almost twice in size, and genuine fear shot through her body. Who placed this? Who's filming me? Claire still wore her sleeping gowns, so she quickly put a simple attire, so the camera wouldn't capture her in a vulnerable state. After that, Claire set out on a mission. If there was a camera in her room, who's to say that there could not be more in the house? Claire's search brought her to every room in the home. And after about 30 minutes, she sat down, exhausted, on her porch chair. The frightened woman placed 6 cameras on the table next to her. Her hand was shaking as she lifted it from the 6 tape devices. Claire didn't hesitate. Her trembling hand reached into her pocket, grabbed her phone, and called the police. The still anxious Claire explained the dire situation in her home and asked the police to come by as soon as possible. Luckily for her, a dispatch unit was in the neighborhood and could be there within 10. When the cop car arrived, the officers saw a trembling Claire sitting nervously on her porch chair. She explained the situation again, and even the police officers seemed shocked. "This is highly unusual," one said. Luckily, the uniformed man and woman stepped into Claire's home and didn't find a 7th camera. But the 6 Claire found had to be taken back to the station. There, they had special equipment for these things. With that equipment, they would enter the camera's server and see what they captured. Claire was scared about what they would find, but handed them the cameras anyway. "We will have a result within a couple of hours." "This process goes quite quickly," the female officer stated. Claire nodded and waited nervously by the phone. She didn't want to miss the call from the police, and she definitely felt unsafe moving through her own house. What if there are still unfound hidden cameras inside? The frightened woman called off work and waited by the phone on her porch table for hours. And then the device rang. It was indeed the police, and when Claire answered, they painted a disturbing picture. They said one of the cameras had a clear view of the street. Police saw a gray van parked there for days and spotted the same man hovering around her home multiple times at night. "Who is he?" Claire asked. The police also had an answer to that burning question. They stated that they were able to enlarge the image and read out the number plate on the parked van. "And the person who the car belongs to is your brother," the female officer stated. "We're on our way to arrest him right now." After hearing the officer's statement, Claire stood motionless for a few minutes. This news shocked her because she had not seen her brother in over 15 years. They parted ways after their parents died, and the two of them never had the best of relationships. What is he doing here? Claire's head was full of questions, so much so that sweat was breaking out on her forehead because of it. Why was he here after all this time? And if he wanted to see me, why wouldn't he just call? Is he the one responsible for the cameras? What does he want from me? These thoughts and many more plagued Claire's mind for the entirety of the evening. The police were already long gone and promised to look into the case. But that left Claire alone in her home with only her worried mind to keep her company. She felt unsafe, but still tried to sleep. But the next morning, when she woke up, a huge surprise awaited her outside her house. Claire did not wake up willingly that day. It was around 6 a.m. when the doorbell rang. The nervous Claire shot up from her horizontal position and sat up straight in her bed. Who rings at this hour? She waited momentarily, hoping that the person in front of her door would go away. But when, after a few minutes, the doorbell still rang, she put on some quick clothes and walked downstairs. The door opened, and Claire carefully peeked through the open slit she created. "Hey, sis," was spoken. Claire let out a high-pitched scream. The frightened woman stood face to face with the last person she wanted to see. Her brother had arrived on her doorstep, which shouldn't be possible since the police had set out to arrest him. But Stephen simply smiled and said he was released due to insufficient evidence. There was a palpable tension in the air, and every bone in Claire's body wanted to run. The frightened Claire placed her hand on the doorknob and tried to slam the door in her brother's face. But he had a different plan. Stephen placed his foot in the open slit, preventing the door from closing. When Claire realized that blocking her brother with the door was out of the question, she turned around and started running. But before Claire could leave the hallway, Stephen said something that stopped her in her tracks. "I did not place the cameras, but I think I know who did." Claire turned around and stared at her brother, who now stood in the open doorway of her home. She said nothing but made a gesture with her hand, inviting him to come inside the home. It was a complete turnaround in behavior compared to a minute ago, but Stefan's remark sparked intrigue. Claire told her brother that she knew about his car being parked in front of her house, and she also said that the cameras spotted him walking across her front yard several days during the night. "What's that all about?" Claire demanded to know. Stephen did not deny this fact at all. But he stated that he did these things for the right reasons. "I scouted the area to protect you, not to infiltrate your life. That's why I didn't make myself known. I wanted to keep you safe in secret. Safe from the real predator in your life." Claire asked who her brother was referring to. And that's when Stephen decided to drop a bomb on his sister's life. He stated that it was her ex who placed these cameras and who was threatening her life. Claire cried and said this had to be impossible since he was in jail. But Stephen countered that remark. He was released 2 months ago. And what added believability to Stephen's story was that Oliver, Claire's ex-husband, visited him shortly after getting out of jail. "He showed up on my doorstep and threatened me. But most of all, he showed anger and resentment against you, sis." And that shocking news wasn't even the end of his story. Claire's brother stated that Oliver said he would visit Claire and monitor her every movement. He was going to stalk her life and make it a living hell. Claire couldn't believe it. Stephen's story was compelling and believable, adding a new layer of fear to the already scary story. Why would he do that? Stephen told his sister that he didn't know. But he wouldn't let anything bad happen to his baby sister. "We might have lost touch, but I never want to see you get harmed. I had to surveil your house to ensure he did not appear." Stephen was also convinced that Oliver had placed the cameras. Claire agreed with Stephen's story and was thankful for his brotherly love. She was starting to panic, though, and wanted hard proof that it was indeed her dangerous ex-husband. If he did, in fact, infiltrate her life, she needed a restraining order against him. "Do you know where he lives?" Stephen unfortunately could not answer that question and even tried to talk Claire out of searching for him. He felt that with the cameras gone from her house, she would be safest at home. Going out and looking for information about Oliver would only result in finding more trouble. But Claire didn't listen. Claire was determined to find out more, and maybe she could end her misery by doing so. The first step was to call her lawyer. He was the one who arranged their divorce right before Oliver got incarcerated. Maybe with his help, she could get more proof and set up a restraining order against him. But after calling the lawyer, Claire was even more confused than before. Because the softly spoken man indeed knew of her ex-husband's whereabouts. But that was the problem in this case. After Oliver's release from jail, he immediately moved across state lines. and he now lived in a house over 5,000 miles away. Claire's lawyer followed up this factual bomb with another confusing statement. He said that Oliver was monitored daily at his new address. He could hardly go to the supermarket without the police knowing about it. So, according to the lawyer, it was almost impossible for him to reach Claire's home. After hanging up with the attorney, Claire stared at her phone in confusion. Her brother's story was compelling and highly believable. Still, the factual information conveyed by her lawyer was disputing a lot of it. There was only one way she could get any answers. Claire needed to go to the police. The frustrated and anxious Claire grabbed the car keys from the kitchen counter and ran to her vehicle in the driveway. Stephen was invited along and took a seat right beside her. But somehow, the brother who was so kind and protective before seemed different this time, nervous in a way. He kept repeating the story about Claire's ex-husband and stuck to it. But what Claire noticed most of all was his tapping finger and rapidly moving eyes. He kept saying that he wanted them to return home. Police stations made him nervous. After a while, he even begged her to turn around. Eventually, Stephen managed to convince her. After all, he was her brother, and he tried to protect her, so she had to give him some credit. After a quick 180 and a 10-minute drive back the way they came, Claire and Stephen arrived at the house. "Would you like some coffee?" Claire asked. Stephen nodded as the two of them made their way into the kitchen. Claire was busy looking for coffee filters to place into the machine while Stephen walked past her to a cabinet in the corner of the room. "Blue or red?" he asked before opening the cabinet without a moment of hesitation. Claire stopped looking for the filters and stared at her brother with fearful eyes. She watched as Stephen pulled a blue and red cup out of the cabinet, and Claire started trembling in response. "I have lived here for 2 years now, and you have never been inside this house before. So how do you know what cabinet in this entire kitchen holds my cups? You did not even hesitate for 1 second. And how do you know that there was 1 red and 1 blue cup inside?" Claire watched as the happy, smiling expression on Stephen's face changed into an emotionless one. The brother and sister duo fell quiet after Claire's questions. They just stood on opposite sides of the room and stared at each other. It was like the stalemate you see in movies, where something bad was going to happen. The calm before the storm. They both realized what was about to go down. And then, out of nowhere, Claire started to run. She pushed herself through the open doorway and ran into the house's hallway. Stephen instantly ran after her, and this time, he did not try to convince her of his innocence. The frightened sister made it to the front door first. She opened it. Stephen followed closely after her and caught up with her in the front yard. But there he was, met with a huge surprise. A full squadron of police vehicles was parked all around the house, and multiple policemen and women were pointing their firearms at the out-of-breath brother. "Hands up!" Police Sergeant Johnson and Officer Miller, the 2 cops who had helped them before, stepped forward and placed Claire's brother under arrest. Their arrival was perfectly timed and was the last thing the still jumpy Claire expected. She approached Agent Miller and asked her how they knew it was him. And that's when the policewoman revealed what their investigation found. She stated that even though they had to let Stephen go due to lack of evidence, something still felt off. So, on the order of their sergeant, they used their technology to trace the number plate back to Stephen's address. Once they were at his place with a proper warrant, things went quickly. They knocked down the door and found boxes full of evidence, all highly incriminating. There were letters filled with angry accusations toward his sister, Claire. They all blamed her for the large inheritance she received from their parents, claiming that half should be his. Police also found the feed to another hidden camera that was still tucked away somewhere in the house. Officer Miller pointed at one of the uniformed men who had just come walking out of the home, holding the last device. The camera was still rolling. And on it, Stephen was clearly spotted inside the house. While Claire listened in disbelief to the female officer's statements, Stephen's head was being pushed through the car's doorframe. He was about to be driving to the station and would spend a long time in jail for stalking, threatening behavior, and endangerment. but not before he had one last chance to speak. The angry man gave a final statement. He said that he found that his mother's jewels and a large sum of the money his parents left Claire belonged to him. So he monitored Claire's every move, hoping to find out where she left them so he could steal them back. Claire said nothing in response, knowing that this was exactly why her parents never gave him a dime. She was just happy to see her horrible brother being driven away. It was like a shadow was lifted of her life. And now she could finally look to the future without worry or fear.